So I have the honor to introduce the first speaker to you, who will open this conference with him, Nadim Habib. He's a lecturer at the Nova School of Business Economics, and he will be talking about future-proofing the organization. Looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. Okay, good morning, everybody. A few disclaimers first. I have very little social network experience. I have no Facebook, no Instagram, no any of that. So I was a bit puzzled when Anna invited me to speak, because I was like, social is something I don't do. I do have a LinkedIn page, though. And I have a picture that was taken for it. So it's interesting for me, because what I've seen in the past 5 or 6 years is an explosion in this concept of we need to connect people to talk more, we need to connect people to talk more, et cetera, et cetera. And it's interesting to me to see that, because the one thing I do study and I love to study is organizations and their performance. And one thing we've noticed is that most people who are working today are complaining about the fact that they have no time for anything, which is really interesting, because everybody talks about having better conversations in organizations where people basically are stressing out of their heads. So when we look at workloads across modern organizations today, one of the things we've noticed more and more and more is people are complaining about overwork, over email, over meetings, just too much of everything. And the data is actually quite frightening. We have incredible high levels of stress and anxiety. We have incredible levels of difficulty in collaborating, because people who are stressed and anxious tend to not collaborate. And what we tend to have is a lot of moving of the wheels, but very little traction in terms of organizational performance. And this is really an issue that we're seeing across Europe. We're seeing it in the US as well. And it's starting to break some of the myths that we have built around managing organizations that finally are starting to break. I mean, one of the first myths that you see in any organization is this concept that if you want to succeed, you need to work hard, when all the data is showing us that this is not true. If you're working hard, you're not succeeding. It's very simple. And so what we tend to see is we suddenly realize that there's a series of issues regarding organizations, the way we manage them, that are surrounded by myths that unfortunately are not true. And it's this shock, with this clash with reality, that's starting to cause problems within organizations. So let's start from the beginning, okay? When we look at most organizations today, people are overworking, and it's a significant amount of overwork. We have people with extremely high stress levels, people with sleep disorders. We have incredibly stressed and anxious people who obviously then infect other people. The main complaint they have is that they spend too many hours doing nothing, too many hours waiting for other people to do something which they then don't do, too many hours in meetings that are totally useless, and reading too many emails that are totally useless as well. And this is probably the most educated workforce we've ever had, reporting that this is the reality they live in. And so the question comes in, why is this happening? You know, and we've got to be careful, because many times we think the solution is a tool. We just needed a tool, when in fact, I think the solution is slightly deeper than that. So why is it happening has been my obsession over the past 20 years in my research. Simply because I moved from London to Portugal, convinced that I was going to come to a country where I was going to have a better quality of life. And I came to Portugal, and I work harder here than I ever did in London, and I produce less than I ever did in London. And this is one of those great dilemmas you live with. Actually, the Portuguese are among those who work most hours in the world. Just to let you know, the country with the highest workload in the OECD is Greece, which kind of tells you the challenge we live here. Because if I asked you, how hard do you think the Greeks work, most people would slot into immediately, they can't be working. Look at their economy. But the fact is that they work on average 2,070 hours a year, compared to a German who works 1,350. So the gap's 700 hours a year between a Greek and a German, yet the Germans go there and say, you need to work harder. Okay? Same thing happened here. We got funds from the Troika when the crisis hit, and one of the measures the Troika imposed on Portugal was to cancel holidays, because clearly they felt we needed to work more when the Portuguese already worked 500 hours more a year than the Germans. So this is kind of the classic thing we're starting to see, which is we start to realize that much of our policy is driven by people who actually don't know what they're doing, not because they're stupid, but because simply there's a lot of myths and fallacies around organizations and how they work that are used to drive policy. And so why is this? Well, to a great extent, it's because at my university it's the same, but for many, many years we had a division between what we called economics and management. And what was really interesting is economics was considered a science, and the people who did it were scientists, and the people who were dealing with management were considered artists. There was this concept that management, anybody can really do it. It's kind of, you make it up as you go along, you post a few things on Facebook, you write some things that a baby falls 20 times and then gets up, so follow your dream, and stuff like that, and that's management, okay? And I have nothing against following your dream, but I often tell my students, if you have lots of money to lose, follow your dream. If not, get a job. And I'm being cynical, yeah, but I'll get back to that a bit later. So here's the deal. Organizations are underperforming, and we know this because if we look at labor productivity growth over the past 150 years, what we see is between 1850 and 1910, they grew an average of 0.4% a year. So every year we produce 0.4% more. Between 1920 and 1970, we shot up to around 2.2% a year. And here's the bad news, people. From 1980 till today, we're back to the rates we had back in the 1800s, which means with the internet, with the PC, with everything we've got, we're actually working worse and producing less than we used to in the past 80 years. Actually, the glorious times of management and organizations was between 1920 and 1970. After that, it's been a decline that hasn't stopped. And it's this lack of labor growth that's causing us many times, in my opinion, social problems. Typically, the strongest indicator of income growth is productivity growth. So in countries where productivity is not growing, income is not growing. And we get people who are angry because they are doing their part of the bargain. They're working hard, but they're not succeeding anymore. And this is where populism sort of comes up across Europe and North America, which is, it's very easy for somebody to come up and say, you've done your part of the bargain, you've worked hard, you're not succeeding, it can't be your fault because you're working hard. And this is what we're seeing across most countries, and we see this in the US as well. And so let's just make something great again, just means let's go back and balance back what was promised to you that's not being delivered. So what is it all about? Well, to a great extent, what we're starting to find out is that most companies are actually not managed very well. And this is not a surprise. If you look at most of our graduates, when they go into the job market, one of the things they report back to us is how surprised they are at the level of bad management in the organizations they are joining. They are shocked at how badly some people lead. They're shocked at how disorganized many organizations are, and they're shocked at how stuff is made up as going along. I'm not exaggerating this. This is continuous feedback we're getting from a new generation of people joining the job market. The one thing they say they learn most is how they're not going to lead, because they have lots of examples around them every day. So, on that happy note, what is going on? I think the first thing we have to understand is, what is management? Well, here's the deal. For the past 20 years, management has become an academically important issue in the sense that business schools in Europe have started to appear among the top schools. But please accept that until the 90s, nobody in Europe studied management. It just wasn't something we did. We didn't think it was necessary. The logic was very simple. Mommy wanted you to study three things: medicine, engineering, or law, and then she'd say, with that, you can manage anything. And so we have engineers managing companies with the results that are phenomenal. We have doctors managing hospitals, which makes healthcare the worst managed sector in the world. And we have lawyers who think they can manage as well. And I have nothing against people like that managing. But please, learn how to do it. Get yourself an education. And what we're finding is that 80% of managers today are what the economist calls accidental managers. So I start off as a marketing guy, and the next thing you know, I've got a team. And it's like, oh, let me make it up as I go along, et cetera, et cetera. And all these people literally think management is an art, as in every opinion is valid. When in fact, what we're starting to find is that management is a science. There's a right way to do it, and there's a wrong way to do it, and stop making stuff up. Okay? It's a science. I hate to say this. And actually, this started back in 2007, when a few economists, which we're now calling empirical economists, started trying to measure how well managed our organizations were. And surprise, surprise, the best managed organizations were in Germany, where people don't work a lot, and the worst managed organizations in the OECD were Greek. Ta-da! You want work-life balance? Improve your management. Do not make a law, et cetera, et cetera. And these are the type of things we know are happening. Because to a great extent, we have been trying to deal with overwork for almost 20 years. 20 years ago, the HR department, in a freak-out moment, invented work-life balance, which everybody knew was not possible. both nice to talk about. And more recently, we talked about things like finding balance through mindfulness and stuff like that. And maybe I'm just showing my age and being cynic, but hey, it's first thing in the morning. At least you have something to talk about in the coffee break. We're just dealing with symptoms, 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 symptoms. Okay, so why are we having this problem? Well, basically because we don't see management as a science, and let's be honest, the US kind of did, because the US started teaching management in schools in the 50s, while we only started in the 90s. Even my school, which in English is called Nova School of Business and Economics, in Portuguese is called Nova School of Economics. The business doesn't even show up, because it's not as cool or sophisticated as economics. I studied economics. All I ever did was study economics. And when I started working, I knew nothing. I literally knew nothing. And thankfully, the world was slow enough that the company could spend 5 years teaching me the basics before I actually started producing for the company. So what is management? And when was it invented? Every year, I open up our master's programs with a welcome speech to the students, and I say to them, listen, guys, it's a science, first of all, which means there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. Stop making stuff up, okay? Number two, it's a very young science, so we still have a lot to learn about it, and we need to keep publishing and researching so we can solidify the stuff. The first management book ever written was written in 1911. Okay, so we're about 100 years into the cycle by a guy called Frederick Taylor. You've all heard of him, Taylorism. It's a bad thing, it's a good thing, what is it, etc., etc. Actually, it's when the world was changing because management came about. And just to show you the depth of change, Queen Victoria was worried about it, so she legislated to limit child labor to 12 hours a day. You know, we had Karl Marx showing up going, come on, work-life balance, give me a break. And so he wrote his little book, and Taylor had his little book, and the world was really shifting because for the first time we were uniting people in buildings, working towards a common good, and this aspect of how do we get them organizing and communicating and working together, etc., etc. And Taylor comes along, and it's interesting because Taylor published his book in 1911, and from 1920, we start seeing an uptick in labor productivity, especially in the US, which is an interesting thing because that keeps going till the 70s and then it slows down. So they were doing something right. And then it stopped working. And so the question is, what were they doing right and why did it stop working? So let's look at what Taylorism is all about. It's a guy who writes a management book in 1911, so he's going to be very influenced by the world he's living in. So in 1911, the world was very different. In 1911, only 3% of the US population could read and write. So 97% of workers are ignorant, therefore you'll probably design the organization very top-down, very command and control, very rule-based. There's rules for everything because you're not smart enough to know what you're doing. So we'll have a huge hierarchy, etc. Underlying this is a social contract between labor and organizations that we see till today, which is, I will give you hours, you give me money. We still see labor contracts across Europe with an hour component, which is a bit ridiculous, but it made sense at the time when everybody was ignorant because you just wanted their hours, so you tell them what to do. These days it's slightly different. And then there was a second, more sneaky one that still exists in many European countries in their legislation, which is, I will give you obedience and you give me protection. And this paternalistic obedience relationship between employees and companies, we still see time and time again. It's actually very, very present in the political landscape, where the big debates between left and right is typically about who's going to take care of workers and who's going to abuse workers, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In Portuguese legislation today, you can fire an employee for disobedience towards a boss. So you can imagine your meeting where you're going, come on, be proactive. You're mad. Right. Please criticize me on the network. Yeah, right. Okay, so this is the classic stuff we're seeing is Taylorism created a contract between labor and organizations that we still see today in most structures. And basically, you were a boss because you were smarter. Given that ignorance was the termination of lower level labor, the way you were promoted is by knowing more, so knowledge became the driver of promotions, and therefore, if you're a boss, you must be smarter than everybody beneath you, which, trust me, most managers still believe. Although they must accept, because I know this, that every generation that comes in is smarter than you ever were, because our education system improves and improves every year. We still think that the CEO must be the smartest person in the building, which is not true. And one of the things our students report is as they rise, they are shocked by how many unsmart people they meet on their way up. And I have to say to them, that's because most organizations don't know what they're doing. He was promoted to boss because he was the best guy at the time. And that's how it works. Okay, second condition of Taylorism is because you don't have a lot of smart people, stuff doesn't change a lot. Smart people tend to make things change. So you can't have a lot of innovation if you have a lot of ignorance because people don't understand the technology, so they can't implement it, et cetera, et cetera. And so you tend to have slow change. And in 1911, the world didn't change very much. It wasn't like people were online finding an idea from another country and implementing it. Things were slow. Just to give you an example, Thomas Edison installed electricity in Manhattan in 1873, and it took him 46 years to get 25% market share. It's like people would wait 6 years to call for, oh, okay, what the hell, let's take the risk. Okay? I need to think about it for another 3 years before I make a decision. Things are very, very slow. Now, if you live in a world of slow change, the one thing you should do as a manager is focus on something called efficiency. And this is funny because we still use that word today, and then we say the world is changing. Efficiency does not work in a world of change. Let me give you an example. If I have a restaurant and I know how many people are coming tomorrow, I can be efficient in my purchasing. If I know at what time each person will come, I can optimize the number of tables. And if I know what everybody's going to eat at every minute, I can optimize the kitchen. Therefore, for me to be efficient, I need to predict the future, which was possible in a world of slow change. The problem is, it's not the case today. I've been in so many conferences where somebody puts up a slide that says the world is changing, and we all kind of nod our head wisely. And then they go, so you need to be efficient. It's like, no, dude, that doesn't work. You can't if the world is changing. You cannot predict the future. If you cannot predict the future, you can't be efficient. Look at Toys R Us. You know, I look at Toys R Us, they're bankrupt, and people go, oh, they weren't online. No, that's not the point. Toys R Us business model was based on predicting the future. They would plan Christmas in February and order early enough and in volume enough that they get cheaper toys, therefore getting better margins, therefore beating the competition. But what happened was, they'd sit there in a meeting in February predicting Christmas, and they started getting it wrong because our kids went, nope, don't like that anymore. I want a fidget spinner now. And we went, oh, we don't want, you know, and Toys R Us didn't have fidget spinners, and we didn't know what to do, so we went somewhere else to buy them. And this is the reality. It wasn't online. It was their business model was based on efficiency, and efficiency requires predictability, and predictability requires very little change. So Taylorism starts to suffer a lot because it's based on these two things. Managers, very command and control, top-down, obedient employees, and simultaneously, huge predictability, driving efficiency. And then what happened? Well, what happened was, and it's a good thing, we educated people. If you look at university enrollments across most of the developing world, there's a moment where it goes exponential. In the US in the 60s, it went like that. And what happens when education goes exponential? You start getting a critical mass of people who have an education. And people with an education have a really hard time doing one thing, to be obedient. Anybody who's got kids knows this, right? So if you have educated kids, they're not obedient, which is really horrible because you wish they were. But it's one of those things. Do you want an easy life and ignorant kids, which means easy life when they're small and difficult life for you when they're older? Or do you want to suffer when they're young and then you can let go of them when they're older? This is the new parent dilemma. So what we all opted to do was educate our kids. The US was the first, actually. The US had an explosion in higher education in the 60s that in Europe happened 20 to 30 years later. Okay, and this is really important. And we know this because we started hearing about what? The summer of 68, et cetera, and what was that? Well, it was a bunch of people who said, I will no longer be obedient. I need to participate in decision making. If I don't understand why, I'm not doing it. And I don't have to accept your business model, I will change. And where did these people start to work? Typically in American multinationals. And anybody who worked in Europe, and I'm 50 years old, will remember that in the 80s and 90s, best place to work were American multinationals because they treat us like adults, they listen to our opinions, and they invest in our education, which was something local companies across Europe didn't do because they tended to still be very Tayloristic. Just to give you an example, the UK has an explosion in education in the mid-80s. Portugal has it in 92. So what you see is a delay across the world of when we start educating our people, and that's why we're kind of different rates of development as we go along. Now, here's the problem. We have more qualified people. We all know this, okay? Trust me. I look at the kids at my university, and they are so way smarter than anything we've ever seen. Most of them have traveled. Most of them speak multiple languages. Most of them don't actually have a problem with Europe. It's only our generation that thinks Europe is an issue. Because they don't even see countries in Europe. They see cities. They're like Berlin, Paris, Lisbon. They assume Europe is a country. They don't even think about what we're talking about. You know, the older people. It was funny, because I was in a conference the other day, what was called Europe, What Future? And there was about 200 people in the room, and I said, is anybody here under 30? Nobody was there. I'm like, dude, the future's outside. It's the past discussing the future. It's kind of funny. And so, you know, we have this huge change in the way we have people. We have smart people. We have also accelerating change. And the one thing that really starts to hurt is in the 70s, the personal computer comes out and things really start to shift. Because what it does is, apart from having smart people driving change, we now have a change in the structure of competition. What does that mean? Personal computers, information technology, change the structure of markets. So in the old days, small companies competed with small companies, and big companies competed with big companies. Big companies would say, they're small, they have nothing to do with me. And small companies would say, we are a niche player. But what happened is, the PC first, and later the internet and mobile telephony, allowed small companies to get scale, something we've never seen before, where suddenly a guy who owns one apartment can rent it out on a platform and compete with hotels. Never would have happened before. You know, it would have been like a sign in the road, and therefore he'd be limited to a very local market, completely changed the world. We have one-man companies that are competing with huge companies for PR contracts. We have 10 people sitting in Estonia competing for huge software development contracts, because what personal computers did, and the technology it brought, is gave them scale they never had before. But technology also gave large companies something they never had before: speed. They used to be slow because they were big. Now they have speed. They have CRM, they have information flowing inside them, which means they can be much sharper at attacking segments they in the past would have ignored. And so what every company is facing is much more intense and broader competition than it's ever faced before. And it's in this world of turbulence, things are accelerating and changing very, very fast, that our organizations are still trying to manage as if we were Tayloristic. Most companies sitting in this room, and I assume most of them out there, do forecasts every year. And they're hilarious little exercises, because what you do is you predict the future, and then based on your prediction, they give you resources. That's how it works. So I think I'm going to sell a lot. Oh, take more money. We actually don't know what we're doing. We predict the future half the time. We spend half the year explaining why we're not hitting our budget. Okay, and it's really scary, because we're still in the world of, if I can predict the future, I can control it, which is not true. The reality now is we're trying to build organizations where we say, if I build the right organizations, I don't need to predict the future, because they can deal with any future that comes along. And it changes the concept of management from an outside-looking concept to an internal-looking concept about building a very organic structure that can learn and deploy very, very quickly by itself. And for that, it means we have to change the way we manage. Now, we knew this, and in the 90s, we started introducing some changes to our organizational structure. So many people will know this. The first thing we did was we delayered. The idea was, with less hierarchical layers, information could flow up and down much quicker. Nice idea. And the second thing we did, we invented the matrix, which is now you're going to work like a cross. And this means that we're going to have information flowing across much better. And on paper, it's really sexy, which is we got information go up and down much better, information across much better. But we forgot that we're dealing with people. And anybody who runs a business knows that people can be a real pain in the ass. Okay? I know we're all nice to people, but you know what I mean. So what did we forget? If you're a command and control leader, because you were brought up in that logic, you have to control people, you went from 4 direct reports to 11. Now, what's happening is, you're the guy slowing down the company, because they're all coming to you going, so what's your decision? And we have all these leaders going, oh, I'm drowning, I can't make decisions. Yeah, because you didn't change behavior. You have to change behavior, not just org structure. And we changed the organizational structure. We didn't change behavior. We have command and control leaders, and they're getting caught by their employees in the parking lot when they arrive. People are walking them to their car going, I just need to talk to you for a few seconds. Did you see my email, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, our leaders are slowing us down. What I find fascinating is when I book meetings with senior executive, I have calculated that 1 in every 3 is rescheduled. Another 1 in every 3 starts late. And in most meetings, they're stressed. And these are people making important decisions, which is really, really frightening. If somebody was to do cancer surgery on me, I wouldn't like to have the doctor looking like most chief executives. I'd be like, I'm out of here. Yet these are people making big decisions, all right, because they haven't changed leadership concepts. And the second thing, and so it's interesting, the topic here, is it's all very nice to have people in a matrix, which means when we have a special project, we bring people from HR, we bring in people from finance, we bring in people from marketing, we put them together in a team and say, you guys are a team now. But we forget that they're still Tayloristic in the sense that the financial guy calls this guy over and says, listen, I'm going to nominate you for that team. Don't forget who you belong to. And so all these guys going to the cross teams are actually going there representing their areas, which means these new teams that were designed for speed actually become like the United Nations, which means nothing happens. And so what actually happens is we change the org structure, but we didn't get the collaboration we wanted because for me to collaborate, I need time and space. And one thing I don't have is time and space, so screw collaboration. This is the bottom line. And so be careful. It's not a tool problem. It's not a problem of having the wrong tools. It's a problem of having the wrong mind space to collaborate. Yeah, somebody said to me, how can we make people collaborate? I'm like, easy. Just give 1 PC for every 2 people. They'll figure it out. Come sit next to me. We give them too many resources, they don't collaborate. That's the first thing we do, is we don't have time. We really don't have time. And so we need to change the way people behave. And this is why, for the past 30 years, academia has started working on what many practitioners called the soft skills, which killed them immediately. You know, because most managers think that managing is doing Excel, right, and PowerPoint, because that's how we grew up. I mean, we love Excel because Excel gives us fake predictability. That's why I often say to my students, if your manager's freaking out, give him an Excel spreadsheet. He'll calm down. It's like the Xanax. Copy paste, 3%, whew, so much better. You know, it's a new thing we see right now. And I think we should have these Excel spreadsheets people can play with in a Google space. Okay? So what's happening is, because we grew up in a world of hard skills, these concepts of leadership through influence and collaboration became what? They became soft skills, i.e., I don't have them, so they can't be important. And the reality is, 30 years ago, they weren't, because 30 years ago, the world didn't change a lot. So there was time for organizations to adjust. But with the speed of change we're facing today, agility becomes key. And for us to be agile, we need to have organizations that are not fast. Please, it's not about speed. It's about making the right decision in the right place at the right time. That's what agility is ensuring that the right decision is taken in the right place in the organization at the right time, which doesn't happen in most companies, because what's actually happening is people on the front line facing customers have zero flexibility. They're getting hit by a customer base that's much more demanding. What do? They shoot things upstream. They go up to the boss, who then replies 6 weeks later. By then, the customer's furious and breaking the house. This is your classic case. And I see this time and time again in most organizations. I see it all the time in customer-facing organizations. We have built these models that give rigidity on the bottom, flexibility on the top, which means when there's a problem on the bottom, they can't make a decision. It shoots up the structure, and people at the top have to make a decision. They're overworked, so they don't make decisions, and they just sit there. And by now, customers are writing to the media, they're on Facebook, they're complaining to everybody, because nobody made a stupid decision. So agility is the right decision, right place, right time. And basically what it is inverting the structure we have traditionally had. So traditional organizational structures said the following: people that are lower down cannot be given any flexibility. So we're going to fill them with rules. We're going to tell them when they have to come to work, when they leave work. We're going to tell them when they can have lunch. We're going to tell them how to fill out an expense sheet. We're going to tell them when they can have holidays, when they can't have holidays, how many days of holidays. We're going to tell them all this stuff because they're underqualified. And the people on the top, hey, you're totally flexible. You can do whatever you want. Actually, the people at the top design rules to control everybody else. That's how it worked. What we see in agile organizations is exactly the opposite happening. We see agile organizations that give enormous freedom on the bottom and have enormous discipline at the top. What they're actually doing is inverting things. And if you look at organizations that are extremely agile, to the outside, they look extremely flexible. Think of IKEA, think of Zara, think of Southwest Airlines in the US. They're companies that, from the outside, they're so customer friendly, they're so flexible. IKEA just takes stuff back, they don't even ask questions, et cetera, et cetera. But on the inside, these are organizations that are extremely disciplined. Every IKEA store is the same. It's always working the same way. Nothing changes. It's extremely rigid on the inside because by having this rigidity, it actually liberates people because people know what's happening. So typically, I know organizations agile because it's rigid on the inside, it's flexible on the outside, and therefore this organization does not need to communicate. So when I do consulting work, one of the things that most people come and ask me for is, can you help us improve our internal communication? And I know some poor guy is going to write a newsletter which nobody's going to read, that they're going to have a Christmas event because that's really what motivates people, you know. And we're going to take a holiday down to the Alentejo to plant some trees to save the planet on our weekend because I really want to tell my family that I want to spend more time with the people at work. That's really motivating. Okay, I'm being cynical. The reality is you don't have a communications problem. You have an alignment problem. Because people aren't aligned around some discipline, what happens is everybody makes up their own plans. Because everybody makes up their own plans, nobody knows what everybody else is doing. Therefore, there's a need to communicate. And it's not about communicating, it's about telling you what I'm doing. Let's have more meetings. Let's launch more campaigns. When the core problem is, if we're all aligned, we do not need to communicate. Great teams do not communicate. They know. So what does this mean for agile organizations? And what does this mean for organizations of the future? Well, it's a toolkit that we've seen being used by successful companies for the past 50 years. Number one, brutally clear strategies. Now strategy, people say to me, it's a plan. Not really. It's a diagnostic first. It's what's the challenge? Let's all agree on that first, because once we agree on the challenge, the plan everybody buys. What most of us see is companies throwing plans at us, and we're like, but why that plan? Why not another one? A good strategy is a conversation about the challenges we face. It's a diagnostic. And we need more on that. And we see that in great companies. They continuously talk about the challenges they face because that's what creates alignment. The second is focus. They focus. They say, listen, we're going to be best in the world in these 3 things, not in 75 things. I love to watch managers telling their team, guys, you need to focus. Because their team kind of looks at them and goes, in which of the 74 things, dude? Because, you know, focus is easy, but tell me which 3 things is what we want. And agile organizations are organizations that say, we're good at these 3 things, and we're relentless at it. And we keep pushing to the extent that we beat our competition so much they give up in those segments. And this allows us to grow even further. And then finally, we accept that the way we lead has to change. Every generation coming in is more qualified than us. Therefore, the only thing we can give them is experience, because they have knowledge. We don't, and we have to accept this once and for all, and it drives me crazy that bosses still think they know more than their subordinates. What we need to give is a framework for this talent to produce results. Now, if you look at business across the past 100 years, they've always done the same thing. They've acquired assets, which is on their balance sheet, which they use to produce revenue on their profit and loss account. Now, back in the 50s and 60s, these assets were tangible. It was machines, it was buildings, etc. Today, these assets are things as culture, talent, the way we do things, knowledge, etc., etc. And just because we don't account for it on the balance sheet for fiscal purposes doesn't mean it's not there. And what leaders today know is that they are making decisions not for the P&L, but for the balance sheet, which means that leaders today know they make decisions that will impact the P&L in 2 years and not today. And it's this strange paradox we see with future-proofed organizations is that they're on the inside are extremely disciplined and rigid, to on the outside be extremely flexible, and that the senior management is focused on the very long run, allowing the younger people to deal with the day-to-day. And these are a paradox because really this is not what we're seeing in most organizations, and they seem to be contradictions. But this is how we future-proof, And when we look at tools that help organizations perform better, if these tools do not take this into account, they just become more noise in the system, more work in the system, and less impact in the system. And in the end, let's be honest about it, what motivates people most is not Christmas dinner, it's to be part of a winning organization. And being part of a winning organization means, one, feel that my company's winning, and two, feel that I'm part of it. And that means understanding the strategy and understanding what my role is. Guys, thank you so much for your attention.